Okay, thanks, Last Count Corla. And firstly, just before I speak directly to the amendments, I just want to say publicly to the Minister, I raised an issue with you earlier on of somebody who is now facing, well, is homeless, and it had been suggested, despite a chronic respiratory condition, that he might be put in shared homeless accommodation. And I raised this with you earlier, and I want to just thank you for responding immediately to that. And that particular person, although he's still in obviously a very difficult situation being homeless, has now been given his own door emergency accommodation where he won't be vulnerable to infection because he's not vaccinated, and he's very appreciative, and I'm very appreciative that the Minister has responded so quickly. So thank you for that, Minister. Obviously, as I said earlier on, the second stage, insofar as this bill seeks to extend protections to a small cohort of tenants, we will support it. Any support for any group of tenants from eviction or from rent increases is to be welcomed, as are the decisions to bring into legislation some of the calls that USI and others in the opposition had brought forward previously. But the Minister will not be surprised to hear that we think that's not enough, and that all tenants, tens and tens and tens of thousands of tenants, are in a very, very precarious situation in this country, and they need urgent protection. And in our view, this bill, this residential tenancy amendment bill, should include much more serious and effective and comprehensive measures to protect tenants from eviction and from rent increases that they simply cannot afford, when you consider that the vast majority of tenants in this country are already paying absolutely obscene levels of rent. Whereas I mentioned earlier on, in my area, 2-bedroom apartment, €2,000 minimum. And very often more than 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. Who can afford that? And if you think about 2,000, that's after tax income to pay your rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, €24,000 a year after your tax. I mean, it's actually beyond belief. It's thoroughly obscene. And on top of that, because of the blanket restriction on further rent increases that you rightly introduced during the pandemic, but has now been lifted, we face a situation where the rolled up 4% and 4% over 2 years can mean that people are facing 8% rent increases on top of those kind of rents. It is utterly, utterly unacceptable. It is equally unacceptable that tenants could be faced with eviction when there's no fault involved. Good tenants who pay their rent, who don't, haven't done anything wrong, aren't engaged in antisocial behaviour, could be evicted, because at the moment, and I really want to stress this point, at the moment, if you are evicted, you are in effect in a homelessness crisis at the moment. In certainly where I live, most of Dublin, and I think people would say the same in Cork, Galway, Waterford, and many of the other epicentres of the housing crisis, such is the level of unaffordability, the extortionate, the rip-off rents being charged by vulture funds, by corporate landlords, or just landlords who think they can make a lot of money. And that is not acceptable, Minister, because if there was a big supply of affordable rental accommodation out there, then you might say maybe it's okay that people can be evicted. But in a situation where there is nothing out there that is affordable, and where there's 100,000 families in one way or another on social housing lists or transfer lists or HAP transfer list with no chance, there is nothing. So almost as a matter of definition, if you are evicted, you're in a homelessness crisis, or very likely in a homelessness crisis. And I've mentioned the St. Helens Court residents to you. I hope you might intervene in the effective way you did today in terms of their plight, but they are in a dire situation, and elderly people and so on working people who pay their rent, a community, all facing the prospect of being in emergency accommodation in the coming weeks, because the protections that they did enjoy during the pandemic have now been lifted, and this bill does not provide them. So these amendments, and they're grouped, are an attempt to address that and to bring into this bill protections for all tenants for the duration of the emergency period as a minimum. Right, so that they involve saying that during the emergency period, and there are amendments to the emergency legislation, for the emergency period, for as long as the pandemic is with us, there should be absolutely no question of anybody being evicted, and similarly there should be no question of people having further rent increases imposed on them, and that there should be no question of when that period ends, of the rent increases being backdated or accumulating, so that people face an 8% or 12% potentially rent increase. Even for those that are protected by this bill, they could find themselves getting a 12% increase. So there should be no backdating of those increases. So that's what these amendments do. And by the way, that's only as a stopgap, because, Minister, we need much more. We need not just pandemic-related protections for all tenants, but we need fundamental reform in the legislation to protect tenants properly. Nobody who pays their rent and who is a good tenant should face eviction. And landlords should be required to sell, if they are selling, with tenants in situation. And I think in the stopgap, if you accepted these amendments, which I know you're not going to, but if you did, you should then bring in legislation that will give that protection to tenants, and similarly to bring in rent controls. And I really think, I don't see what other way you can do it, because I don't believe for 1 minute rents are going to come down. Even if the supply that you often refer to increases and so on, there's no real prospect of the unaffordable rents we're now looking at coming down. We need rent controls, as are standard in many, many countries. Even in the heart of capitalism in New York and places like that, the authorities set rents at affordable levels. And that's what should happen here. And there should be people from a rent board or from the local authority go in, look at a property and say, that's as much as you can charge for that property. So that's what we actually need to protect tenants. And I don't know if the current by-election might be something that might spur you on a bit. It certainly spurred the Taoiseach on in making some fairly remarkable promises. But it might be worth bearing in mind for the government in considering these amendments that there is a huge, huge number of renters in Dublin Bay South. And talking to people on the door, a lot of them are saying, what are you going to do for tenants? What are you going to do for renters? And I really think you should take this opportunity. If it gets you a few votes for Fianna Fáil, I don't care, if it protects tenants. But this is the time when we have to protect tenants from unjust evictions and from the extortionate rents they are now facing. But at the very least, you could accept these amendments, which would mean for the full duration of the emergency period until the emergency legislation is repealed, these are amendments are saying no rent increases, no evictions. And there's a lot of people who would benefit from those, who otherwise, including those tenants I've mentioned in my own area, who are now facing the imminent threat of eviction and homelessness when they have done absolutely nothing wrong. So I would appeal to the Minister to seriously consider these amendments.
Thank you. Okay. Minister.
Yeah, and look, thank the deputies for tabling the amendments. There's just a couple of things. I can't accept the amendments. I'm going to tell you why. But I do want to just inform the House that no one's pretending to do anything. These are real measures that were actually brought in last July, and we've extended them since, and we've brought forward some permanent changes around the whole area of rent arrears, around deposit restrictions, minimum notice periods that are non-pandemic related. And like, there were members here who speak to these amendments, and that's fine. I'm not having a go at them for doing it, who opposed this original legislation. I'm glad since then that people have seen fit, and the House with unanimity has accepted the extensions. Now, I'll deal with the issue of the rent increases in a moment. I just want to explain why these amendments can't be accepted 2, 14 and 15 at last count, Corla. They propose to amend Part 2 of the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest COVID-19 Act 2020. And Part 2 of that Act actually ceased operation since the 1st of August. So with effect from the 27th of March 2020, the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest COVID Act made those exceptional provisions in relation to the blanket eviction ban and the blanket rent increase ban in the public interest in order to mitigate the effect of the spread of COVID-19 in relation to the operation of certain provisions of the 2004 Act during that 3-month emergency period following its enactment, and during such further period if it was specified by government to do so. The emergency period under Part 2 of the Act that your amendments are linked to was extended by the government on the 19th of June and again on the 20th of July 2020, having regard to the threat to public health, obviously, the highly contagious nature of the disease, and the need to restrict movement of people. As I've said, Part 2, though, of the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act 2020 relating to rental measures ultimately ceased to operate with effect from the 1st of August 2020. And it's a matter for the Bills Officer, as to these amendments being in order. I understand the thrust of them, but they would be, they're actually linked to legislation that has actually ceased. The amendments proposed by the deputies are the provisions of an act that are now spent and no longer in operation. So I couldn't actually accept them. I wouldn't be in a position to, even should I wish. I do want to update the deputies on this in relation to and we will discuss this further on because there are further amendments about the issue of the RPZs and rent increases that the Taoiseach has rightly said that we will address it. Firstly, I have advised the House before that we will be bringing forward a significant rent and tenancy reform bill in the autumn. But in advance of that as well, we are working on measures. This bill is at report or committee and report stage right now. We're working on other measures with regard to deal with the rent increase issue, and I hope to be able to conclude the work on that very, very shortly. It isn't as simple, and I don't mean this in any condescending way at all. It's not as simple as some has presented. There are things that need to be worked through. The RPZs expire at the end of this year. I've said time and time again that we'll be replacing them certainly with something better, and that's my intention in the autumn to do that. But what I need to see is what I can do in the short term in advance of the recess, and I am working on that. I can't go into any more detail on it because I don't want there to be any unintended consequences by me making any comment that might lead to something else on it. But I do want to assure deputies that that is being worked on, that will come back to this House when the work is ready on it. These specific amendments, so 2, 14 and 15, I've explained why in real terms I can't accept them. I wouldn't anyway in the sense of where they're at, because they're focused at a section of an act that ceased. So I can't accept them, 2, 14 and 15.
Mr. Deputy Richard Boyd.
Well, first of all, Minister, let's be clear, they're in order. I was somewhat surprised, pleasantly surprised, but they are in order. So I don't really accept your response. I mean, it's tricky for us to amend your legislation without finding ourselves out of order when we're trying to do things that are not, if you like, directly envisaged by you, the author of the legislation. But if you had a will, if there's any technical problem with any aspect of this amendment, or these series of amendments put forward, you could make it happen, right? And you're not really answering the substantial point. By the way, I don't fully, you'd have to explain to me, and I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, but nor am I accepting that it's right. This is our effort to extend the protections that were provided under that legislation. And when you say it's ceased to operate, I don't quite know what that means, right? Because there is still an emergency period operating in terms of some tenants, which are being protected in this, and we want that extended to all tenants. And you haven't addressed the substantial point. And the substantial point is that tenants, the vast, vast majority of tenants, who should be protected in this bill, are not being protected from the prospect of rent increases that they simply cannot afford. Now, you tell me if you disagree, but I don't think anybody seriously could disagree that the level of rents that are being paid by the vast majority of people in this country at the moment, and particularly in areas like Dublin, Galway, Cork, Waterford, the epicentres of the housing crisis, are utterly obscene and unaffordable for ordinary working people. Do you accept that? I'd just be interested to know. Because to me, it's just blatantly obvious. €2,000 a month or more is just not acceptable. How are ordinary working people supposed to pay that? As I pointed out, that's, of your after-tax income, that's €24,000. I mean, that's just obscene. So, do you accept that people can't even afford that? Most people can't afford that, and they most certainly cannot afford to have an 8% rent increase on top of that, as they are facing the very real prospect of, or 12% at the end of the emergency period for even the group that are protected, the small group who are protected by this bill. They simply can't pay it. And that we need rents that are affordable, that ordinary people can actually pay. And I mean, I cited the example of the Helen's Court as a tangible example of this. The people who are facing homelessness, who've always paid their rent, were paying rents of €900 or €1,000 a month. That's a lot. But they could just about manage it. But they are being evicted because the owner of Mill Street Project, the Vulture Fund, want to charge double that. And they know they have to evict them. So they've spent 4 years driving those tenants out, trying to circumvent the legislation, finally have found a way to do it, and they are going to put those people out on the street. And there is no protection for them. And there is no social housing for them in the area. And there is no other affordable rental accommodation in the area that they can afford. Where is the protection from them? Are you going to protect them and other tenants like them? That is the question. And that's the question all those renters out there want to know. If there's something technically wrong with our amendment, you know, give us what is the government's response going to be to protect them now against these things, from either the evictions or the unaffordable rents, because people need to know. And you know, the figures we gave you early on: 38,000 people gone through homeless accommodation since 2014. 1% of the adult population. That is absolutely shocking. Shocking. And there are probably several thousand people who now are going to face in the next coming weeks and months eviction, and they are in dire trouble. Once they're evicted, you are in dire trouble by definition. I mean, do you accept that, Minister? That if you are evicted now, you are in serious, serious trouble. And what are you going to do to protect people who are in that situation? I mean, it is really an urgent question, Minister. It's not, as Deputy Higgins called us, opposing for, what did she say, opposition for opposition's sake. This is not opposition for opposition's sake. This is the reality that renters are facing out there. And we're asking, with these amendments, for the government to insert those protections that will prevent people being put into a crisis situation over the coming weeks and months, while you prepare this more thoroughgoing legislation that you say. And it'd be interesting to know what's going to be in that legislation to address these things. But why would you reject the idea that we freeze things now until that more comprehensive legislation is brought in? Please explain that to me, because I do not understand why you would create a window for unfair rent increases and for unfair evictions.
I'll ask Councillor, very little else to say other than I've outlined why I'm not accepting these amendments. We are actually, and I've been doing very detailed work in relation to the rent increase issue. I expect to be able to bring to conclusion very shortly. I've said that. If some members don't want to accept that, fine. But this whole issue is not about pretending it's a serious issue. I know members opposite take this seriously too. What fundamentally we're doing here is extending protections and provisions. The amendments that are tabled here, just to reiterate, and it's factual, would amend Part 2 of the Act that ceased to be in operation since the 1st of August 2020. I can't accept 2, 14 or 15, and I've outlined why.
Thank you, Minister.